Your Excellency, Madam Chairman, my brother Jesuits present here, my fellow Christians, good evening to you all. I would like to begin by extending a sincere gratitude to Father Pani Adi for inviting me to prepare and present this lecture. And together with him, I thank the entire team of the Arupe Jesuit Institute here in Accra for preparing this event. For me, this invitation is very important and really very special because I understand that it is intended to be a climax event for the Ignatian Year, the celebration of the Ignatian Year 2021-2022. And that makes it very special to me, not simply because I'm a Jesuit, but because I have a profound interest in Jesuit history, especially here in Africa. And that history can never be understood outside the person of St. Ignatius of Loyola, whom we celebrate this year. The Jesuits dedicated this year to mark 500 years since Ignatius of Loyola was wounded in a battle. And that incident, that accident, if you wish, marked the journey of his conversion. And it is his conversion that we are celebrating because he was already a Catholic. But after he was wounded, Ignatius started to think more seriously about his Catholic faith. And so he was not converted to a new faith, a different faith, but he was converted to taking his faith more seriously. And in that process, he opened himself to God. He allowed God to speak to him directly. The insights he gathered during his convalescence were spiritual insights that allowed him to grow in the spirit, to grow, to take his faith more seriously. And what is even more important is that these were insights that were shareable, that he could talk to other people about what he had learned internally. And as he discussed, as he shared his spiritual experiences with other people, gradually Ignatius started to gather other young men of like minds, like himself. And with a small group of like-minded young men, Ignatius eventually founded the Society of Jesus, that is the Jesuits, in the year 1540. And so we are celebrating this journey of conversion, this journey of faith. Jesuits like talking of this experience as an experience of fire that set other fires ablaze. And so what started in Ignatius's own conversion inspired so many other generations of Jesuits down to our own time. If anybody is a Jesuit, and indeed if anybody follows the Ignatian spirituality, it is because those insights that Ignatius paid attention to were shareable. They are still the ones that we build upon and follow his lifestyle and his mission, his spirit of mission, his spirit of service to other people. And so, as Jesuits, we are celebrating this event of conversion, this journey, this fire that set other fires alight, this fire that allowed so many other people to inherit the Spirit and to set out for missions. Now, Jesuits came to existence at an interesting period in human history. a period that is extremely important for our understanding of African history, especially before what we understand today as the colonial period, which really started in the 19th century. So the period before that, the period before the 19th century colonial occupation of Africa, is usually a period that we know very little about. Because most people who study African history, myself included, tend to have an obsession with the colonial period, a period that lasted for not more than a century. Actually, it never even lasted up to a century. And yet, that period still occupies our minds, and nearly everybody writing African history today tends to focus on the colonial period. And yet, there's history in Africa that goes far back centuries. I say that Jesuits came into being at an interesting period in Africa because beginning the 15th century, the Portuguese Empire, some people don't believe that actually Portugal was the dominant empire in the world in those years. But the Portuguese Empire was actually setting out to expand mainly towards the east. And Africa fell in that east. And so the Portuguese were exploring Asia, they were exploring Africa, and parts of America. I'm, of course, focusing on Africa today. Jesuits are important for us to understand that period because they were fully involved in the missions in Africa during that period. Now, before I proceed on that line, let me propose that Christianity has never been out of Africa ever since it started. There's no time in human history where Christianity was completely absent from the African continent. Now, I will explain that a little bit. We probably know about the early Christianity in North Africa. That was really part and parcel of early Christianity, of Christendom, at least in the first 5 centuries of Christian history. That the churches in places like Tunisia, Egypt, and the whole of Northern Africa were an important part of Christianity in the first 5 centuries of Christendom. In fact, they were not just some other part of Christendom, but they were influential, significant parts of Christianity, contributing major ideas to the development of Christian theology and Christian ecclesiology. North Africa was home to giants like St. Augustine of Hippo, like St. Cyprian, like St. Athanasius, like St. Frumentius of Ethiopia. These were Christian giants. Theologians like Origen and Tertullian are theologians who were bred in North Africa. And recent historians are beginning to understand and appreciate the contribution that emanated from North Africa to shaping our understanding of the message of the Gospels, and even more important, our understanding of the church. They are appreciating it in this sense, that the ideas of Augustine and all these other giants from North Africa were actually ideas inspired by genuinely African experiences. Here is one example, and it might be difficult for some people, but it is true, that in North Africa you had many heresies. By heresies we mean ideas, theological ideas that have been rejected as not correct, okay? And North Africa had a lot of that across the first 5 centuries of Christianity. And scholars today are beginning to appreciate the contribution of those multiplicity of ideas to helping the church actually refine its own understanding of itself and its own understanding of the message of the Gospels. That these were trial and error moments. These were moments where scholars were presenting multiple possible interpretations of the scriptures, and it is in that context that then the church was enabled to actually refine its own understanding of itself and of the message of Jesus. This is so important that actually the ideas that emanated from North Africa were critically important in the development of the creed, the summary of the Christian faith as we know it today. And so the contribution of that early Christianity in North Africa is critically important. And it's one that is well known and somewhat beginning to be appreciated anew. After that, the next Christianity that we know about, at least one that most people know about, is the Christianity that we live today, which started towards the end of the 18th century, so the 1700s, and continued, somehow survived during the colonial period, and really took off and prospered, developed significantly after the Second World War. This is the Christianity we celebrate today. We are told, at least from the statistics I looked as I was preparing this lecture, as of 2018, the continent of Africa was home to more Christians than any other continent on earth. It just overtook Latin America, which had just overtook Europe. And so today, Europe ranks third, Africa first, Latin America second. This is the missionary Christianity that we are trying to indigenize today. This is the Christianity that, again, many people know, write about, talk about. And it is important. I want to propose to you that there's another history that we don't know much about, that we don't talk a lot about. And this is from the time Christianity started to dwindle and eventually collapse in North Africa in the 5th century. From that time all the way to the time missionaries come to Africa in the 18th century. We really don't talk much about what happens in between those centuries. Was there no Christianity in Africa? Actually, there was. So today, for the rest of this lecture, I want to focus more on that Christianity, which I would like to call the middle age of Christianity in Africa. The middle age of Christianity in Africa that we don't talk much about, that we actually don't know much about. I think there are at least 4 themes that we need to cover if we were to address that history of Christianity in Africa, that middle part of the history of Christianity in Africa. And the first, if we are to be fair, we would need to talk about continuity in Egypt and in Ethiopia. We would need to know something about the Coptic churches in Egypt and the Orthodox churches in Ethiopia. These are critically important for that middle period. And if I began by saying that there's no time in history where there was no Christianity in Africa, I am confidently saying that because of these continuities in Egypt and Ethiopia, that even though the North African churches collapsed, actually Christianity survived in a small measure in Egypt. It continued up to our time in Ethiopia, actually flourishing in its Orthodox form. And again, a history that we rarely talk about is that it really held on rather tenaciously in Sudan until the 16th century. And so, the first thing, if we are to address that middle age of Christianity in Africa, is to address those continuities in Egypt, in Ethiopia, and until the 16th century in Sudan. The second important thing is that we would have to talk about the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa, which started in the 17th century and has survived to our time. And that too is a form of Christianity that has survived across that middle period of Christianity in Africa. But finally, what is important is that we would also have to address Christian, especially Catholic activities in Africa, at least from the 15th century all the way to the 18th century. And this is important. The rest of my lecture will focus now on that third theme, the Catholic activities in Africa from the 15th century all the way to the 18th century. This is the period I suggested that Jesuits were extremely important. They were directly involved in Africa. Jesuits went almost everywhere the Portuguese were going. Again, you remember, I said that they came into being at a critical moment in history where the Portuguese Empire is expanding mainly towards the east, and that east included Africa, and Jesuits traveled with them. And so Jesuits came to Africa assigned here by St. Ignatius himself as early as 1548. The Society of Jesus is established in 1540. By 1548, we had Jesuits going to Congo, which was already a Christian, a Catholic kingdom. In the same year, 1548, we had Jesuits again missioned to Mozambique by St. Ignatius. And in 1555, again missioned to Ethiopia, Jesuits went, missioned by St. Ignatius, Jesuits arrived in Ethiopia. Coming closer home, we know that in 1554 at least, St. Ignatius was approached and asked to consider sending missionaries to Elmina here in Ghana. Unfortunately, we don't have much documentation of how Ignatius responded, but we are sure that Jesuits were not sent to Elmina, but that conversation was there. So Jesuits become critically important in that period. They were not the only ones, but they were by far the most dominant missionaries on the African continent in that middle period of Christianity in Africa. Some Protestant critics of Catholic missionaries have even appreciated what Jesuits did in Africa in those years. One critic says that if it were not for the Jesuits, really the Catholic Church in that period would have almost nothing to say in Africa. And so the Jesuits genuinely dominated that missionary field. Another Protestant who appreciates the work of Jesuits in that period in Africa is the famous missionary and explorer David Livingstone. Again, when David Livingstone came and toured parts of Africa, he recorded evidence of Jesuit presence in those parts of Africa. And probably that helped me to turn my conversation to something else. So what I'm saying here is that from the time Jesuits were founded to the time they were suppressed in the 18th century and then restored again, They had been in Africa for almost 2 centuries. And so that makes them extremely important. That's 2 centuries of evangelization here in Africa. And so what I'm proposing to you this evening is that for us to understand that middle period of Christianity in Africa, understanding Jesuit records become extremely important. We would have to use Jesuit sources, Jesuit documents in order to understand that period. Now, of course, that's a very bold and probably dangerous statement to make when one is a Jesuit himself. But so many other scholars have highlighted the importance of Jesuit documents in Africa for that period. And recently, many scholars have begun to translate them actually into accessible English so that students of African history can begin to use them. And so I'm not alone in saying that. But even more important, Jesuit documents are important for that period, not so much because of what Jesuits wanted us to understand through those documents, but they are important especially when we read them against the grain. And that's what makes history interesting. When we read Jesuit records and understand what they are not telling us, for example. I will give you an example. So the reason we don't know much about Christianity in that middle period is really because it was not terribly successful in tropical Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. So even though David Livingstone appreciates the works Jesuits did in Africa, he himself wondered, what happened? These people were here for 2 centuries, and yet I can see evidence of buildings. I can even find men and women who can actually read and write, and they can do that because they were taught by the Jesuits. But I cannot find traces of the Christian faith that they were supposed to have preached. And that is a huge question. So we don't know much about that Christianity because somehow it died behind the missionaries. When they left, Christianity died behind them. And when people refer to that history, usually they dismiss it, saying, well, the African soil was really not fertile for the gospel. Africans were probably too superstitious. They believed in witchcraft. They could not give up polygamy, and therefore Christianity could not succeed. But what I will end my lecture by proposing tonight is that when we pay attention to Jesuit records, we actually begin to get another side of the story. That middle Christianity in tropical Africa did not succeed, not because the African soil was not fertile, but because of so many other factors that we are not told by those who failed. And I'm going to propose to you 6 points that we can get out of the documents that I'm talking about. First, I think the missionaries, Jesuits included, sort of rode on the wrong back. What I mean is that if you intended to ride a horse and find yourself on the back of a lion, you've got to be scared. And so the platform for that missionary effort was really the Portuguese expansion. It was the colonial imperial expansion, and that had serious implications for the missions. For example, the history of Jesuit existence in Mozambique leaves a lot to be desired. Every time there's a political crisis in Portugal, the missions in Mozambique were affected. And this is what I mean by riding on the wrong back. I don't have too much time to go into details, but probably we'll have some time for some questions after that. The second point is that there was a significant ignorance about African ways of doing things. And here is my one example. There's an important and really remarkable Jesuit missionary who went to Southern Africa in 1560. His name is Gonzalo Silveira. He died as a martyr. He was really killed because of his faith in parts that are in Zimbabwe today. But the tragic story of Silveira is that he went to convert the emperor we call Monomotapa, and he completely misread the signs, the gestures, the suggestions, the proposals that were coming out of the Monomotapa. The Monomotapa was trying to do everything to sort of court Silveira so that they can dialogue on a par. But Silveira rejected every gift that the Monomotapa was giving him, rejected everything, and so he left the Monomotapa completely powerless. In African traditions in those days, exchanging gifts was a way of building some sort of the parity of status, that we are equals. I give you gifts, you give me gifts, and then we can talk. Silveira rejected all the gifts that he was given by the Monomotapa. In the end, the Monomotapa changed his mind about the mission and ordered that Silveira should be killed. This is what I mean by ignorance about the African ways. The third is what I want to call the power of bad example. The reason the Queen in Portugal was begging Ignatius to send missionaries to Elmina is because there were other Portuguese men, mainly men, but also other priests from Portugal. And the Queen was completely fed up by the bad example the people around Elmina was getting from these Portuguese traders and even Portuguese priests. And so, in a way, these were Christians, and missionaries were supposed to rely on the Portuguese Christian businessmen and women to show a good example. But again and again in the literature, you find complaints. That is true here in Elmina, it is true in Angola, it is true in Mozambique, that these people are a bad example to the people we are trying to convert. The fourth point is what I would like to call really the sin of the world. I think it's time in human history we face the fact that the slave trade, forget about slavery. Slavery has always been around. Slave trade that marked this period I'm talking about is a wound on human history, and it's a wound that is not completely healed. It is a sin that all of us participated in, and that worked against the message of Christianity, the message of the gospel. So I said that David Livingstone appreciated the work of the Jesuits. But as he wondered why he couldn't see the trace of faith, he proposed that probably their relationship with slave-dealing Portuguese must have undermined their work. Okay, I admit that could partially explain the reason the faith didn't go far, but it's really not enough reason to explain everything. The fifth point you can find in the document is that there's ignored foundations. And I think our current Christianity is just beginning to appreciate that. That rather than building on the religious foundations of the Africans, these were condemned, and the missionaries, Jesuits included, wanted to start on a clean slate. And that did not work. Eventually, Africans were not giving up everything traditional and religious. They are willing to give up some things, but certainly they are not willing to give up everything. And finally, it's what I would like to call a harvest of little sowing. What I mean by this, and again you find this in the literature, is that when you compare to Asia, for example, and if you just focus on Jesuit missions, there were others, Franciscans, certainly Dominicans and others. If you focus just on the Jesuits, the number of missionaries sent to the African missions was minuscule. So for example, the first mission in Mozambique collapsed, not so much because Silveira was killed, but because 3 Jesuits were sent there. One fell sick and returned to Goa. The other one was Silveira, who took off to pursue a grander mission at the Monomotapa. And the one that had started well, almost prospering, was left with only 1 Jesuit. And there's a limit to what 1 Jesuit can do in an entire mission. And this story repeats itself again and again in Angola, in Congo, in Ethiopia, and in so many other places in Africa. And so what I'm suggesting here is that there was genuine poor sowing in terms of personnel and in terms of other resources invested in the African missions. All these points, you can argue for them. You can find evidence in the records left behind by the Jesuits. They can help us begin to understand why that Christianity did not go very far. And for me, for those of us today in Africa, celebrating just about 200 years of Christianity and rightly celebrating its prosperity, it is critically important for us to understand why our forefathers and foremothers failed, why our predecessors failed on this land, so that we do not repeat their mistakes. I'm saying that Jesuits had been here on this continent for over 200 years, and yet when they left, Christianity died behind them. We celebrate 200 years today of prospering Christianity. We are not sure how long it will last. And I think this is an important challenge to all of us, to understand the past so that our present is well grounded. We do not repeat the mistakes of our forefathers and foremothers. So let me end by concluding that middle period of Christianity in Africa had its challenges, and we are better served understanding those challenges. I contend that the challenge was not of a poor soil, but one of poor sowing, and that this can be proved through the Jesuit records I'm making reference to. Thank you very much.